Yeah. Hello, guys. Welcome. So as Nick mentioned, we are the last panel of the first day of PitchCon, which is pretty exciting. I'm happy to hear that everything went so well today in terms of fundraising. We are looking at starting pitcher ADP battles. So that's something that Nick and I started last week, kind of highlighting pockets or clusters, if you will, of starting pitchers who are going close in ADP and trying to make sense of who we would pick or avoid within that to help you with some of your draft day decisions. Before we get into that, though, Scott, Dave, do you want to just kind of reintroduce yourself to the people, let them know maybe where they can find some of your stuff before we dig into the analysis?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, being with two GOATs, I'll just try to Chris Bosh my way with Dwayne Wade and LeBron James here. My name's David Mendelson. You can find me on Twitter at DMendy02. You can find all my stuff pretty much baseball related on the Triple Play Fantasy Baseball podcast and over at Fantasy Pros. And I'm excited to talk some pitchers with you guys tonight, so I'm pumped.
All right, and I'm Scott White. You can find me at CBS Sports. My handle is CBS Scott White. I've been there, I think this is my 17th year now with CBS. So I've been there a while and been doing this fantasy baseball thing for a while. So I don't know. I feel like that's all the introduction I need.
Yeah, that's great. You win the background challenge of the evening between the three of us. Just looks very comfy over where you are.
Well, you know, it's funny on our own podcast, people give me a hard time for this. They tell me it looks like their grandmother's living room, which
I mean, it's better than my bare white walled room that looks like somebody just threw me in a corner somewhere. That's all right. So we're starting at the top, and I'm going to present this one, and then I'm going to step back because Nick and I kind of already debated this. So I'm curious on your thoughts. We're starting our first cluster is guys pretty much going in the third round of 15-team draft. So we have Kevin Gossman, whose ADP, and I should say, sorry, this ADP is NFBC drafts over the last 2 weeks. So that's 32 NFBC drafts that we're pulling this ADP from. So Kevin Gossman with an ADP of 29 as starting pitcher 5. Luis Castillo, ADP of 30, who is SP6. Pablo Lopez, ADP of 35, who's SP7. And George Kirby, ADP of 36, who's SP8. Scott, start with you. Anybody stand out to you as either like an avoid or a target, or do you kind of like everybody in this range?
Well, look, I have them all. I'm sorry. I have 3 of them basically in the same tier. I don't include George Kirby as part of this tier for me. And the reason why is also the same reason why I like Kevin Gossman the most of this group. And this is going to be a common theme as we go through this. You're probably going to get annoyed with me saying it, but the reason why is strikeouts. So everybody knows Spencer Strider had the most last year. Kevin Gossman had the second most. And beyond that, he had 8 starts with double-digit strikeouts. That's compared to Pablo Lopez having 4, Luis Castillo having 3. So, you know, even if a situation where you anticipate injury for pitcher, you know, the individual starts for Gossman are going to be maximum impact. And what I think is the most critical contribution for pitchers. And I'm not exactly breaking news with that, how important strikeouts are, but I'm doubling down on it this year because of what we saw happen last year across the majors where, okay, so there was the shift ban that meant more base runners. There was the rules to encourage more base stealing that meant more activity on the bases. So more runners on base, more action on base, more trouble, just generally speaking. And when pitchers found themselves in trouble, because of the pitch clock, they were forced to keep up the tempo unlike they were before. So they had trouble wriggling out of that trouble. And you saw these like blowout starts across all parts of the pitching rankings. It affected the high end guys as well as the mid-range guys. And it could do so much damage to a pitcher's ERA and WHIP in just one night that it began to feel kind of like a random number generator. So I don't want to fall victim to that when I draft pitchers this year. By investing in strikeouts, that is, I feel like in this environment, that is the one thing I can feel confident in a pitcher delivering on. If a guy strikes out batters, he's going to strike out batters. It's the most predictable of the pitching categories. And it just so happens that missing a lot of bats might go a long way to preventing base runners and trouble on the bases too. So it might improve my ERA and WHIP ceiling just as a side effect. But mostly it's about, I want something to trust in it starting pitchers, and I think it's strikeouts. And that's why I prefer Gausman of this group.
Are you, Dave, are you also in on Gausman over the rest?
I think it's going to be interesting. And I know Scott brought up the strikeouts, which I think is a good way of attacking drafts this year. But another thing I think, as I've gone through going position previews on our show, is a lot of the risk you want to put in on pitchers is also going to determine where I want to draft hitters in my draft, right? Like I might like this group of pitchers in this round, but then another ADP battle, I might be looking at hitters at that point in the draft. Right. And that might deter me from wanting to take people from that group for that reason. But going to this specific group of pitchers, I think we know who Gausman is at this point. Obviously, he has a splitter, which Nick has talked about, I think, as much as anybody. That's kind of the pitch that has the most volatility to it here. In this particular group, I like Pablo Lopez and George Kirby a little bit more than the first two. I think they're all great pitchers, obviously, but obviously price plays a factor here. And I think Pablo Lopez has another gear that he showed last year. Obviously 180 plus innings in back-to-back years, which I think we think of Pablo Lopez, we think of all the injury, quote unquote, problems he had with the Marlins, but he's been very consistent and upping his K percentage, 6% this past year to 29%. I was really interested looking at his game log because he really changed up like his formula for how he pitched this year. So you would think, okay, maybe he's going to be heavy fastball most starts, maybe mix in his sweeper, which I think was also a big part of his success. But his last 6 starts of the year, he decreased his fastball usage in every single start, up to slider usage along with some of his other secondaries. I think he really learned this past season just how to give teams different looks so they would never see the same Pablo Lopez start to start. And I think that's what made him become from just a really good pitcher to become a great pitcher this past year. So I like him to get him after the first 2 guys. And in George Kirby, I mean, he's been consistent in both of his seasons he's been starting. 190 innings last year, so one of only 15 pitchers to get 190 innings. Obviously, we know he's a walk god in terms of just how little he puts guys on base here. So I think, you have his obviously mastery of the plate, but combine that with the fact that I think there's another gear in terms of strikeout rate. I think these are 2 guys. I like them at the end of this tier, and preferably getting Pablo Lopez, but I'll be happy to get George Kirby if he's taken by my pick.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the way that Pablo Lopez pitches because it's another opportunity to remind people that Nick did a full breakdown with Pablo Lopez, breaking down one of Pablo Lopez's starts where he talked through kind of like his thought process and how he was attacking hitters and why. And I would encourage you to watch that, even if you have to break it up into different sittings, just because it's really important to listen to a pitcher talk about how he's attacking and why he's making the decisions that he's making and how he adjusts based on results, because that we are speculating on that based on watching and numbers, and this is a guy actually explaining exactly why and exactly that thought process, and that is also part of the reason I'm in on Pablo Lopez. Gausman worries me, and I understand exactly what Scott's saying about strikeouts, and I think there's nothing wrong with having Kevin Gausman as your SP1 in fantasy, especially this year when so many SP1s or typical SP1s are injured. My concern is I think the whip will always be slightly high for an ace. 1.18 isn't high, but it's high for somebody you're drafting, as a top 5 pitcher. And part of like what Nick and I have mentioned is part of that is he's essentially a 2-pitch pitcher with the splitter and the 4-seam, except the 4-seam isn't really good. So he basically becomes a 1-pitch pitcher because the 4-seam allowed a 12.6% barrel rate last year and almost a 50% ICR, which is the pitcherless stat that's ideal contact rate, which is barrels, solid contact, and flares, all divided by batted ball events. So it includes like really hard ground balls. And the fastball also only has an 8.7% swinging strike rate. So it gives up a lot of hard contact and doesn't miss bats, which means he really relies on the splitter. And also the splitter, he only throws in the zone 28% of the time. it's obviously a nasty splitter and gets a lot of swings and misses, but he's just putting a lot of pressure on that one pitch. And that's why, to me, my personal preference here is Luis Castillo. I feel like if I'm taking a starting pitcher this early, I like the safety that I feel like I'm getting with Castillo. And I like the fact that he's now like a fastball slider guy and not the fastball changeup guy that he was with the Reds, because I think that leads to more strikeouts, like Scott was saying. But I love that we kind of all attacked this from a different angle, because I think it shows you that there are different paths to take here. And that kind of leads me to my next question before we get to this next cluster, which is, given the injuries to guys like Sandy Alcantara, Shane McClanahan, Brandon Woodruff, Jacob deGrom, Max Scherzer, how are you guys approaching your strategy with guys like this, with, aces, SP1s? Is your thought, okay, there are fewer guys that I used to consider an ace, so I have to make sure I get one early? Or is your thought, like, outside of maybe, Cole, Strider, Wheeler, Burns, who seem to be kind of like the consensus top four, or, maybe you just consider three of them, who knows? There's really risk with everybody. So I'd rather lock in my hitters, wait to see which starting pitcher kind of falls in that third or fourth round range, and jump there. Dave, I know you mentioned you kind of were talking about that on your podcast. Do you feel like you have a firm strategy in place right now?
I used to love always going, especially in points leagues. I would attack pitching really early. I would try to get 2 pitchers in my first 3 rounds. And last year just showed how volatile it can be. I mean, there were so many high-end pitching injuries, and you could see the value of guys. Obviously Cole Reagans is probably the biggest name of somebody you could grab later on that would help win you your league. I really want guys that are going to be 5 category contributors early on, lock those guys up. And I know there was an increase in stolen bases, but there's only so many guys like Ronald Acuna or guys like that, Jose Ramirez, ones that will give you 30 plus steals, like locked up in the bank. And then on top of that, will also give you power. And I want to make sure I get my 5 category studs early on. And I mean, there's so much depth, and there's a guy in another tier we're going to talk about later who is my favorite. I don't even want to say he's a sleeper, but I think he's going to have a huge year this year. And I would much rather wait and try to get as many of those guys as I possibly can and just stack up more depth and volume than try to take a shot for those high-end guys that, again, last year showed. Corbin Burns was good last year. Was he worth a first-round pick? He wasn't. So I would much rather go hitters early and take from a big, I know Scott always calls it the glob. They take it from the glob later on. That's kind of how I would like to attack it.
I mean,
you feel the same way, Scott?
Yeah, I agree with that overall approach. I'll say that my reasoning behind it is I don't feel like the ace class of starting pitchers is as bankable now, given some of the environmental changes that I laid out earlier. So I don't think the return on investment is as promising. And I see a much clearer drop off, and David kind of referred to this. I see a much clearer drop off within the hitter ranks, where you have nearly 2 rounds worth of really high end MVP caliber hitters, maybe more like 2.5 rounds worth of hitters that are that far ahead of the rest. And then once you get past those, the hitter ranks, it's a little harder. It's harder to tell them apart.
Right.
And so I think that's when you really dive in on pitching head first and accumulate as much of that second and third tier at the position, rather than going all in for the aces, who may not turn out to be aces and who would require you to sacrifice a truly elite bat.
Yeah, I'm with you both on that. And I think the interesting thing this year will be, even if everybody has that same strategy, I think you'll find that it could still work, because I think you'll find that as we just showed in that first ADP breakdown, the pitchers that people want to go with in the glob or in the like 3rd, 4th, 5th rounds, I think will vary pretty drastically in like who you're targeting. That you may have a pitcher you love who's going in the 4th round and somebody else is not interested. And so you're able to wait, even if other people are waiting, and you're able to kind of get the pitcher that you like, because there are so many options with question marks that it just depends on which question mark matters the least to you when you're drafting. And that kind of leads me into our second cluster, which are guys that to me all have pretty major question marks. We have Zach Gallen with an ADP of 40, who's going SP9. We have Tyler Glasnow with an ADP of 41, who's going SP10. And then we have Yoshinobu Yamamoto with an ADP of 45, going SP11. The question marks here, obviously, Zach Gallen gives up a ridiculous amount of hard contact. So can he continue to pitch at a high level with that? Tyler Glasnow, obviously injuries. And Yamamoto, we've never seen him pitch in the big leagues before. So what do we... How much can we trust what we've seen from him either in the World Baseball Classic or in the NPB? Scott, do you like this tier? Are you avoiding it? Is there somebody you appreciate in this tier?
Well, I actually consider Gallen to be more part of the previous tier. I would take Gallen over George Kirby from the previous tier. So I guess he's my choice here from this group, which kind of contradicts my overall strategy at pitching, which is to sell out for upside, sell out for strikeouts. Certainly Glasnow and Yamamoto have really special upside as far as that goes. But there is a safety concern here, especially with Glasnow, who's 30 now and has never thrown more than 120 innings in a major league season. That's a big red flag. And I think reason not to pass up on Gallen, who is, I think, pretty bankable. I mean, I understand the dominance indicators aren't as strong for Gallen as for a lot of the other pitchers that we consider top tier. And I've had my own, I've played the doubt game with Gallen before. I remember coming out of, or going into 2022, remember he had an elbow issue in 2021, actually having to do with the ligament, and his swinging strike rate cratered in 2021. And I thought he was going to be a big time bust in 2022. He compensated by improving his control. And meanwhile, the swinging strike rate has slowly climbed back up since then. It was pretty good again last year. He did give up hard contact. That was less the case in 2022. But I think more than anything, you know, when you have these kind of like underlying doubts for pitchers, or really any kind of player, if they go multiple years where it's just not an issue in terms of their results, I have a hard time worrying about it. That's part of the reason why I like Gausman so much from the previous group. He's pretty much been the same guy since joining the Giants in 2020. And that's why I feel pretty comfortable with Zach Gallen, certainly relative to the injury risk of Glasnow and the unprovenness of Yamamoto.
Yeah, I agree. I think you don't punish Gallen for the fact that he consistently gives up hard contact. But I think what you say is what you see is what you get. Like that 3.5 ERA is pretty much, I think he earns it. I don't know that there's like another level where you say, oh, but if he stops giving up hard contact, or if he starts missing more bats, then maybe he's a 3.2 pitcher. You know, maybe he can get to like a 3.1 ERA. So, and I know we've seen flashes before.
2.54 in 2022 when he didn't give up as much hard contact.
Yeah, and I guess that to me, it's like, how much do you buy that end of season stretch that he went on there, which was like that insane run where he didn't give up an earned run, and I mean at this point I forget how many innings it was, but it was a stupid high amount of innings. And yeah, you're right there. He has shown flashes of it. I personally don't believe that is bankable over a full season, and that's why I think that he is kind of what we saw last year. I think that's who he is as a true talent. But again, I don't have a problem with taking him. I guess it's depending on whether you're chasing that upside that conceivably Glasnow and Yamamoto have the higher ceilings, but also potentially the lower floors. And David, I don't know if you are also kind of choosing Gallen because of that out of this group, or you're chasing the ceiling of one of these guys.
I'm more chasing the ceiling of Yoshi here, because I think like with first Glasnow, I think Scott touched on it, like 120 innings, a career high. Dodgers are basically talked about going 6-man rotation. There's just too many concerns there, even though he could be the most dominant pitcher in fantasy next year, and it wouldn't surprise me. I'm not comfortable taking him this early, so I will be out on him. Gallen is interesting. Like he's the example of a pitcher where like, you know what his end numbers are going to look like. You know, he's going to be like kind of a low to mid threes ERA, about, you know, close to a strikeout per inning. But there's a lot of volatility throughout the season. He can go through those dominant stretches where he's not giving up a run, And then I know this because I would bet on Spencer Strider to win the Cy Young last year. So it was between him and Gallen and Snell. So I was watching every single start really closely. And then you see, Zach Gallen go through a stretch at the end of the year. He gives up 7 earned runs, 5 earned runs, 6 earned runs in a 4-start stretch towards the end of the year, 6-5-0-7. Like, and that 7 at the end was against the Mets, who did not have a good offense at the end of the year. So like, we kind of know that there's volatility there, but we know the tidy numbers will be at the end of the season. For me, Yamamoto, for what we're hearing, they say he's the best pitcher to ever come from Japan. He's got 3 pitches that are already considered elite. I know Eno Saris talked about like comparing all, the certain pitches to major league pitchers right now. Mm-hmm. If I don't leave any drafts with Yoshi, I'm going to be really upset. So I have to say here, I will probably kind of chase the forbidden fruit and go for him, Yamamoto here. Obviously, Gallen's not a bad choice. I think he's a solid pitcher, but I think Yamamoto will be higher than this next season. So I will take the discount here.
I will have to say, of these 3, the one I would be most excited to draft is Yamamoto for some of those reasons you talked about. I mean, you read the scouting reports of him. Saris is in particular, and it's like it reminds me of one of those like slow news day kind of stories that comes out where somebody takes the ideal characteristics from several different pitcher and combines them into the super pitcher. It's like the curveball of Max Fried, the splitter of Kevin Gausman, the command of George Kirby, and you wind up with Yoshinobu Yamamoto. Sounds pretty impressive. I hope that's who he ends up being, but we haven't seen him pitch a game other than the World Baseball Classic.
Right.
We haven't seen him pitch in a major league game, I should say. And I don't know. That's just an element of uncertainty that for the cost, particularly if you're drafting him as an ace.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I could do it over Glass now. I'm not sure I could do it over Gallen.
I mean, it'll take one good spring training appearance, and if he looks as electric as people say, then it's going to be at least this ADP, if not much higher, and people are going to jump on it. I'll make the case for Glass now real quick, and then you guys can either shoot me down or say, oh, that's interesting. And I think when push comes to shove, I probably won't draft him where I currently have him ranked because I believe in the talent, but it scares me in a way. But so here's my thought. Glasnow has done interviews this offseason where he's commented that basically the injuries were all interconnected with something mechanical and compensating for previous injuries that led to further arm injuries, etc. And that he has kind of like learned his body and learned from it and, believes that they're behind him. Obviously, players saying that is very different than, it actually being the case. We do know that he had surgery and is on the mend, and there's the Tommy John honeymoon and all of that kind of stuff that we have read about before. We talked about all the risk baked into pitchers right now within this range anyway, that nobody really seems like a sure thing, whether it's the injury history of guys like Glasnow and Pablo Lopez or, the kind of like we've never actually seen them as an ace, like, some of the guys we'll talk about in the next tier. If I get 130 innings from Glasnow, so that's not a crazy difference from what I saw last year, even though I know last year was a career high. I know that every single time Glasnow has been on the mound, he has given elite strikeout rates, an elite whip, and a pretty solid usable ERA. 3.53 isn't great, not terrible, right? On maybe the best team in baseball, one of the best 3 teams in baseball, depending on how you think it actually shakes out. So if I could take 130 innings of what I know will be elite production on the mound, given the risk of all the other pitchers around him, isn't this the year to maybe just go, you know what, I'm just going to do it because I don't really feel that much safer with some of the other options. And especially if maybe not in NFBC formats, but if I'm in a format where I can just throw him on the IL and replace him, then I know that every time he's on the mound, he's going to be good. And when he's not on the mound, it's going to be because he's hurt. And I'd rather take bankable production than a guy like maybe some of the guys in the next tier who we talk about who could just blow up my ERA, my ratios, not get me strikeouts, anything like that.
Yeah, I agree with the gist of what you're saying. And I do have Tyler Glass now as a top 10 pitcher this year. The issue for me is just at what point do you say, to heck with safety and security, I'll just take the upside. And I think it's a little after this, which is kind of what you were saying too, maybe compared to some of the pitchers in the next tier, and not so much comparing him to Zach Gallen and Yoshinobu Yamamoto. And I'm pretty much with you on that. So yeah, I think you broke it down nicely.
Well, thanks.
Yeah, I agree.
Let's get to that next tier then. And then you could tell me if any of these guys are interesting, because I do have one guy in this tier who I think separates from the rest. This cluster is Max Fried, we have a little jump here, is ADP 60. So that's starting pitcher 15. Framber Valdez, ADP 61, which is starting pitcher 16. Logan Webb, ADP 62, starting pitcher 17. And then Blake Snell, ADP 63, starting pitcher 18. David, what's your take on this tier in general? And is there anybody here that stands out to you?
Definitely one that stands out, man. Let freedom ring. Max Fried, man. I think since he became a full-time starter in 2019, 19th in total innings pitched, 572. His 3.06 ERA over that time is 10th best in the league. And only two pitchers that have both those numbers have had better overall production than Fried. That's Garrett Cole and Shane Bieber. I think the main thing that comes down for me to him is he has such good control. His walk rates are always very low, playing on one of the best teams in baseball. Framber Valdez was very volatile last year. Blake Snell, we know he's the poster boy of volatility, leading the league in ERA and walks, which hadn't been done. I think it never had been done, or maybe once. And Logan Webb, I think is consistent with innings, but I think at the end of the day, Max Fried is the one I think that clearly is the outlier in this group. And I think he's kind of suppressed because of the injuries last year, but he's not even an injury prone pitcher. I think last year was his first year with actual injury concerns that affected most of the season for him actually making starts. I think Max Fried's at a discount this year. So I will be taking Max Fried definitely in this group.
Now, I thought you were going to say that the outlier here actually was Logan Webb, because okay, better ground ball rate than Max Fried, better walk rate than Max Fried, way more durable than Max Fried, 216 innings last year. Max Fried has only once even gone 170 innings. And last year, with all the trouble his forearm/elbow gave him, I'm not totally confident it's completely right now. So I think Max Fried has a major workload concern there. I do think he's pretty safe for ERA and certainly wins. But ERA, as much as any pitcher in this environment can be safe for ERA, Max Fried is among the best. But I don't know. He might be the one I'm least likely to draft from this group. And Webb, even though I think he's superior, I don't know that I'd be especially likely to draft him either, because neither Fried nor Webb gives you an especially big strikeout total. And you know who does is Blake Snell, which is the least reliable of this group, the scariest of this group. I'll be the first to say that. There are times in the past few years where I have really resented drafting Blake Snell. I mean, in the middle of 2022, when he was going 4 1/3 innings per start and walking nearly as many guys as he was striking out and boasting an ERA over 5, I was on the verge of dropping him in some 12-team leagues. And the only thing that redeemed him was this crazy finish in 2022. And really his 2021 was a lot like that too. So 2 years that were kind of lost, at least the first half of the season, it's fair to say you were burned by drafting Blake Snell. And then comes last year, where he goes on to win his second Cy Young Award. And okay, is there any hope of him doing that again? Well, I'm skeptical. Like 5 walks per 9 and he won a Cy Young. That's pretty much unprecedented, right?
Yeah.
But he gets so many strikeouts. Even at his worst, he gets so many strikeouts. And one of the things I noticed for him last year, as he was dominating in between all the walks, was his curveball and changeup both became so much better. What got him into trouble in 2021 and 2022 was using them too much, and they just weren't good enough to justify it. And when he was able to turn things around, it was by really focusing in on his fastball and slider. But he did kind of the opposite last year. I don't know what changed for him with those pitches, but he ended up with the curveball and changeup being so good. He had 3 pitches with better than a 45% whiff rate, did Blake Snell, and 2 of them had better than a 50% whiff rate. So it's dominant stuff. And in an environment where I don't think you can rely on anyone's ERA too much, I'm just kind of making the case I did at the top of the hour, remaking it. In an environment where you can't rely on anybody's ERA too much, I'd rather invest in the strikeouts, which Snell will for sure give you.
Yeah, I hear that. I mean, I think, the big difference in looking at his pitch mix between 2022 and 2023 was, as you mentioned, we're kind of switching up how he attacked. Way more curveball and changeup usage in 2023 compared to 2022. Both the curve and the changeup had essentially 25% swing strike rates. There are some movement profile differences on both of those pitches. Nothing that stands out drastically. Like, he may have tinkered with some stuff. Nothing looks like it was like a brand new pitch, but could have changed the grip or changed the way he attacked with certain things. Curveball was a little slower, had a little bit more drop, so that could have been a conscious decision. For me, it is that volatility of this is the only year we've seen it come together as good as it did. Not saying it hasn't come together before. Blake Snell has been a good pitcher before. But the walk rates have reared their head in ways in years past that pushed the ERA much higher than we saw last year. To the point where I have no problem with Blake Snell. I prefer Fried, and there's no argument on the strikeouts. I mean, I don't think even the biggest Fried supporter will tell you that he's going to strike out as many guys as Blake Snell. It's not going to happen, barring injury to Blake Snell, obviously, even though Fried has his own innings concerns. I just think you're talking about a guy who's being discounted because of injury when he made 14 starts after the forearm strain and looked good, and then he had a blister at the end of the year. So like that isn't the arm issue, right? The injury at the end of the year, the blister, is not connected to the forearm strain. And he's got 5 pretty elite pitches, doesn't give up a lot of hard contact at all. And why I like him over Logan Webb is that even though like they're both kind of ratio suppressors, first of all, I prefer the team context on the Braves. Fried had an 11.7% swinging strike rate, and Webb had a 9% swinging strike rate. So Fried has slightly higher strikeout rate, but if I'm banking on anybody to actually have a better year in terms of strikeouts, I just don't think it's Logan Webb. I have no problem taking Logan Webb. I think, again, in this year where you're talking about all the uncertainty, the safety that he gives you is solid. I just think there's more upside to Fried, given that he misses more bats and allows softer contact and is on a better team. But for me, the outlier here is like I have Framber Valdez barely inside of my top 30. And maybe I'm low on him, but to me, putting him in this category as the 16th starting pitcher off the board, I can't get behind it. And if that's where he's going, I'm going to have 0 shares this year, and I'll feel fine about it.
Yeah.
Not excited to draft him either. Yeah. Unless it's a points league. It changes in a points league.
His volume.
How deep he goes into his starts. But he's kind of strikes me as a format specialist at this point in his career.
Agreed.
One of the things about Blake Snell, too, that I'm kind of staying away from is he only pitched into the 7th inning 3 times last year. So you have, obviously, the crazy walk rates didn't bite him this year. You had him, only getting 5-6 innings pretty much every start. And then on top of that, what Blake Snell does, right? When you buy back into Blake Snell, he just burns it every year. So, I feel like he's just setting us up for it again. So, yeah, I mean, like Scott said, the strikeouts are definitely obviously going to be the best of this group, but I'm worried for Blake Snell for next year.
It's between him and Glass now, who's the ultimate test case for this new approach I'm trying, where I just kind of ignore everything but strikeouts up to a point. I mean, if Blake Snell had a 140 whip last year, then I wouldn't rank him so high. But up to a point, ignoring everything but strikeouts and just seeing seeing how my ERA and whip turn out if I do that, because I know my strikeout total is going to be good.
Yeah. I have a feeling this is the year for that. I'm with you on it. Speaking of injuries, though, this next cluster of pitchers, at least two of the three of them, huge injury question marks after last year. We have this is probably our biggest jump in ADP. We went from guys in the 60s to guys now going after outside of the top 100. So we have Walker Buehler with an ADP of 110 going starting pitcher 29. Joe Musgrove with an ADP of 112 going starting pitcher 30. And Tanner Bybee with an ADP of 115 going starting pitcher 31. Scott, anybody here, or is this kind of like a run for the hills, let this whole thing pass me by sort of grouping?
Well, we're kind of beyond the 11K per 9 guys now, so I don't know who to pick. No, they all have major downside concerns, I would say. Bybee, it's just a provenness thing, and Buehler and Musgrove, of course, is health. Buehler coming back from his second Tommy John surgery. That's a lot harder than coming back from the first. Musgrove's the one I like here the most. I think I'm actually higher on all three than the consensus, but Musgrove's the one who I think especially so. So he missed a long stretch of time last year with shoulder inflammation, and it was basically fine by the end of the year. There was just no reason to bring him back, and reports this offseason his shoulder's fine. I just don't find that particularly compelling. I know shoulder injuries are always kind of scary, but that seems like it's on the mild side. And I feel like we're downgrading him too much because of that, because he has been so bankable since joining the Padres, consistently ERA in the low threes, whip around 110, right at a strikeout per inning. And usually, before last year and the shoulder inflammation, usually gives you a nice 180 innings too. So if not for that shoulder thing, he would seem about as safe gets. And again, I'm saying the shoulder thing seems like it's overblown for Joe Musgrove.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't know, David, is that who stands out for you in this tier as well?
Ladies and gentlemen, your American League Cy Young winner, Tanner Bybee, is my guy that I'm picking from this. He is my favorite pitcher to draft this year. I think he is going to be in the Cy Young running in the American League. I think you look at his rookie season. I mean, again, anytime a rookie puts up a sub-3 ERA, you're going to take notice. But he did it in 25 starts. So it's not like he was in there for just half a season. He was put in April. Obviously, like Scott mentioned, not an 11K per 9 guy, 141 strikeouts and 142 innings. So he is giving you about a strikeout per 9. Missed the end of the year with right hip inflammation, but he was really what stabilized that rotation last year with Shane Bieber in flux, Tristan McKenzie, who I liked last year, being injured pretty much all season. Bybee is going to be pushed this year. But one of the things that's interesting is if you combine his innings pitched between the majors and the minors, he pitched 157 and a third inning. So he has room to make the potential jump to close to 200 innings this year. I know he wanted to pitch at the end of the year because he was trying to chase that American League Rookie of the Year title. If you look at his ERA metrics, they're all roughly close, in the threes ish roughly. So not too far off from his actual ERA, a 12.4% swinging strike rate. He's got a healthy 95 mile per hour velocity on his fastball, and he's got a very low fly ball rate at just 33%. I think the biggest thing with this guy is he's going to have to take that leap that we saw Kirby kind of make, in the sense of, like, we didn't think of Kirby as a huge strikeout pitcher, and then he started mixing in his other besides fastball, started mixing in other pitches, and he kind of had those games we saw, like the 10 plus strikeout games. And Bybee didn't really get quite to that point. I think he can get there, especially with an above average swinging strike rate on a slider and curveball that he throws a decent amount. So maybe takes, the 47% fastball. And I know Nick Pollock is not big on Bybee's fastball. So maybe if he decreases his fastball usage just a little bit and throws more of his other offerings, I think there's the blueprint there. A guy that had a mediocre fastball, throwing a sub-3 ERA in his rookie season in 25 starts. He plays in the American League Central, which is obviously you've got a lot of, the White Sox might be the worst team in baseball next year. The Tigers have the best ballpark to pitch in. So when he plays on the road against them, I'm just very excited for Tanner Bybee this year. I think he is going to be on a mission to prove people that this 31st pitcher off the board, that should be cut in half. And I think to me, he's a top 15 pitcher this year.
I'll say this for Bybee. I don't get why he's going so far behind the other standout sophomores, meaning Yuri Perez, Grayson Rodriguez, and Bobby Miller. I do rank him fourth of that group, but a very close fourth when he's going like 30 to 40 picks after them. And I don't think that makes sense. You mentioned sub-3 ERA as a rookie. It was 2.40 over the final 3 months. And this is what stood out to me most for Bybee. So I made reference to Zach Gallen improving his control the last 2 years. Zach Gallen in the minors stood out most for his control. And then he came up to the majors and was walking 3/9 early on. It didn't make a lot of sense. That's what happened to Bybee as a rookie too. Control was his selling point as a prospect. And then he comes up as a rookie. He's walking nearly 3/9. That's got to improve.
Mm-hmm.
And that he managed to do what he did, even with it being what it was, I think is a very good sign.
I have Bybee outside of my top 30. I have him well below Bobby Miller, Yuri Perez, Grayson Rodriguez. I have him below both of the Mariners' second-year pitchers that we'll talk about later on. I am prepared to be wrong. That's fine. I mean, you can't fault what he did last year. And I could be reading too much into just like the individual pitches that he throws and my concerns with them. First, I think the 0.82 homer per 9 is not repeatable. I do think that had a huge impact on why he had a 2.98 ERA. Given the fact that he gave up a decent amount of hard contact, I think, balls start leaving the yard a little bit, just even to get to like league norms, not like something outrageous. I think you're already looking at an ERA kind of in the mid 3s. I share Nick's concern about his fastball. I don't think it's a particularly good four-seamer. We've seen a lot of Cleveland pitchers in the past have success without a good four-seamer, so we understand they're an organization that is able to game plan around that. There are two concerns I have about his secondary pitches. First, the slider, despite having a good swinging strike rate, had only 49th percentile put-away rate. The curveball had only a 53rd percentile put-away rate. So in terms of getting swings and misses when 2-strike counts, neither one of those pitches is particularly good. His best swing and miss pitch with 2 strikes is a changeup, which is obviously going to be far more consistent against lefties than against righties. And then my other concern, and this is why I've really been digging on the pitcher list metrics and their player page stuff. So I look at like his slider. His slider has, and is actually, it's his slider and his curve. His slider has 70th percentile high location, and his curveball has 80th percentile high location. So he's throwing his breaking balls up in the zone a lot. And while they were missing bats at points, like I have a fastball that to me is mediocre, and I have off-speed pitches that are being left up in the zone more than I would like to see. And while I know that those got swings and misses or those got strikeouts during the year, we also looked at like they don't get swings and misses as much in 2-strike counts. And part of that could be because of the location of those pitches. He might be, freezing guys or getting more called strikes in those counts because they're not expecting like a high slider or a drop-in curve, things like that. So to me, I think there needs to be some approach changes. And not saying he can't make those changes. He's a very young pitcher who did well in the minor leagues, and he could very well change his approach in his second year in the majors. For me, though, I just am a little concerned until I actually see that happen at this level. I think that there may be some adjustments to what he does. And I just generally, like Nick and I kind of share I get nervous about pitchers with a bad fastball because I just don't think it gives them a lot of wiggle room if things aren't going well for them. And so that could be me unfairly punishing Bybee, but that's why I have some concerns about him.
But one thing I would combat that is, again, making 25 starts over a full season, with the amount of that teams can watch him. And I mean, you can
Yes.
look again like at your minor league success too. So over a full season, if his, obviously, again, like you were saying with the poor parts about his fastball, how are teams not able to make those adjustments? Because then if he's able to overcome a poor fastball in his rookie season and over 25 starts, teams are getting a chance to see that fastball consistently. What that scares you away this year from the success he had last year? Because again, if the fastball is the same, what's going to be different?
Well, I mean, the fastball itself wasn't particularly good this year or last year. It had a sub 9% swinging strike rate. And on the year, if I take off my first half splits, on the year, according to Alex Chamberlain's pitch leaderboard, it had a 382 defense independent ERA, which, takes obviously defense out of the equation and just says, what does this pitch earn based on batted ball contact? And Alex also gave it a 544 PFIP, which is his predictive ERA metric. So a lot of the underlying metrics suggest that the four seam well outperformed what it should have. So if you, again, not saying the metrics say it's a 544 pitch, so it's definitely a 544 ERA pitch. But when I have concerns already about the lack of induced vertical break, the fine but not great velocity, the way he locates it, and then you also see metrics that support that and say this actually performed way better than it should have. To me, that gives me a little bit of pause of saying, we've seen guys get lucky with particular pitches. We've seen, guys get away with stuff, and yes, I will not push back on your claim. 25 starts is a lot to just say he got lucky. I'm not suggesting that, but I'm suggesting I think there are still some obstacles to his development that I would like to see before I truly buy in to say what we saw last year is indicative of a pitcher who's, of the tier of guys like Yuri Perez and Grayson Rodriguez and Bobby Miller, where when I watch them, I look at their pitches and to me, visually, they're in another league than Bybee in terms of just their raw stuff. And again, maybe that's putting too much weight on like reaction to just like the individual raw movement and shape of the pitches. But with guys that young, if I'm trying to project for growth, that's personally at least where I lean. It's like, if this all clicks, what does it look like? And to me, those three guys, if it clicks with their raw stuff, it just looks on another level than what it looks like for Bybee.
Yeah, that's fair. I would say that's fair. I often say that a good fastball, like a fastball that can really get whiffs, is probably the biggest indicator of upside for a pitcher. And you're kind of making the reverse case where one that doesn't is kind of the biggest indication of downside for a pitcher, which I could see. So, yeah, I think that's, compared to those other three, Bybee maybe has the lowest floor and the lowest ceiling. But in the end, I still expect it to be pretty good.
He definitely could. I'm not ruling that out. We've got another cluster. We're going to try to sneak in two more. Cluster 5 is kind of like older guys trying to reestablish themselves in a way. We've got Jordan Montgomery with an ADP of 144 going SP 36. We've got Chris Sale with an ADP of 150 going SP 37. And we've got Michael King, now a starter in San Diego, with an ADP of 151 going SP 38. David, is there an NL Cy Young Award winner in this cluster?
I mean, we saw from Michael King at the end of last year, he could win it, but I don't think he will. But I mean, he looked like the real deal at the end of the year. I think the only reason he wasn't talked about as much is because Cole Reagans kind of stole the show for the last month, 2 of the season with his performance. But I mean, a 2.75 ERA on the year, 127 strikeouts, a 115 WHIP, and 104 and 2/3 innings. He started 9 games, and if you just look at his September, his entire first month as a starter, a 1.30 ERA, only 21 hits allowed, and 39 strikeouts over that time, and 27 and 2/3 innings. He's got 4 pitches. I think, his sweeper 16% swinging strike rate on that, a changeup that has a very low batting average against, and a 22.5% swinging strike rate. I think he's definitely the one I'm looking at the most here. Jordan Montgomery obviously does not get a lot of strikeouts. I think he's good, but especially also, Scott talking about the strikeout mentality he has this year. Not a lot of strikeouts. I think he's very inconsistent. I know he had, a great year with Texas last year, but I probably won't be taking Jordan Montgomery. Chris Sale is just too many injuries. He's going to get hurt at some point. I'll just keep it simple with that. I think Michael King is my favorite upside pitcher to take in this group.
All right. Based on the way I've gone with all the previous clusters so far, who do you think I'm taking from this cluster?
Michael King.
No,
I
Chris
think
Sale.
it's Chris Sale.
Chris Sale.
It's Chris
Okay.
Sale. It's Chris Sale. I mean, King, look, if with a little more track record, it might be King, because I was very impressed by what he did down the stretch, but there's no reason to believe, given the trouble he had staying healthy out of the bullpen. I'm not confident how long he'll last as a starting pitcher as well as it went. But Sale, I mean, look, I've long kept the faith on Sale, and it began to diminish a little bit last year. And the reason it began to diminish is because the other injuries he dealt with, okay, there was Tommy John surgery, pretty typical for pitchers to have at some point in their careers. Then there was like a fractured wrist, a fractured rib cage, not really injuries that you associate with pitching as being, like occupational hazards for a pitcher. They're just things that happened. Bad luck for Chris Sale. And so I was keeping the faith. Last year, the injury was a stress reaction in his shoulder, which does seem like a pitching related injury. So I wasn't sure I was going to be in on Sale this year until the Braves went and gave up their biggest trade asset for him. And I'm to a point where I have so much faith in Alex Anthopoulos that I found that trade to be the most reassuring thing you could tell me about Chris Sale's chances for 2024. And, at that point, if we're not going to be scared away by the injury risk, last year, Chris Sale still had the 5th best K per 9 rate. If he had the innings to qualify, it would have been 5th best. Swinging strike rate would have been 9th best among qualifiers. Like he still knows how to miss bats at a very, very high level. And so I'm going to take him here in the hope that he delivers kind of what we're hoping Tyler Glasnow does, just much later in the draft, give you 120 to 140 really dominant innings.
I'm with you. My argument for Chris Sale is basically exactly my argument for Tyler Glasnow, but just later in the draft, as you mentioned. Also, I talked with Nick about this on the podcast. I understand that we like quantifiable reasons for drafting guys, and so I understand this one isn't, but we all know Chris Sale is a very competitive dude. I think that's made clear by literally everything about his personality. And the interviews that he gave after being traded from Boston, where he just flat out was like, I didn't earn my contract. I didn't pitch enough. I wasn't worth the money they gave me. I'm pissed off. Now we have Chris Sale with a fully healthy offseason who feels pissed off that he didn't earn his last contract, who's now going to the second best team in baseball, maybe. And I just think this is a guy who's going to be locked in when he's on the mound. And again, as Scott mentioned, was actually very good last year when healthy. And that's even when you watch him realizing he didn't have his best stuff. If you watched him pitch, you were like, the fastball location is a mess. Every now and then he has an inning where he just loses it and gets lit up. And despite all of that, he was actually still really good over the course of the year. So if he does kind of shake that rust, or, he's not going to get back to the old Chris Sale, but I think that there's a middle ground between better than we saw last year and not quite as good as he used to be that makes him a really great value right here. And I also really like Michael King. I actually have them back to back in my rankings. I just prefer Sale. And I have Jordan Montgomery outside of my top 50. Wow. I think we're buying a little bit too much into the playoff run and a pretty solid stretch toward the end of the year. The 3.20 ERA came with a 4.25 Sierra. It came with just a 15.2% K- walk rate on the year, which is well below average. It came with a super pedestrian 11.4% swinging strike rate. He had a 29% CSW. So nothing he did was overly impressive. Pitcher List has him marked down for a -22 hit luck, which means basically he got lucky on 22 additional hits, which is like the 5th most of any starting pitcher in all of baseball, which kind of adds to like, why is the Sierra so high and the ERA so low? His put away rates on all of his pitches are low. They're below average. I think that he's a fine pitcher. I think he's always been a fine pitcher. I don't know that I believe that he's that much different of a pitcher now than when he was with the Yankees or with the Cardinals, in the sense that I think you're getting probably a mid 3s to a little bit higher, like 3, 6, 7 type of pitcher who's not going to strike a lot of guys out and will give you solid, but like a 1-2 whip is fine, solid. There's nothing wrong with it. So that's kind of where I'm at with Jordan Montgomery, where it's like, I don't have any problems, but a 3.7 ERA pitcher with a 120 whip who doesn't strike guys out is not as, it's a little bit more replaceable than if I get what I think I could get from Chris Sale, or if Michael King even is half of what he looked like at the end of the year and throws 130 innings, not 150 or 60 or whatever. And then I have some other guys who we might talk about later who I just think the upside is a little higher than with Jordan Montgomery.
Can we make a friendship pact right now that if Chris Sale burns us again this year, that we will be officially done with Chris Sale?
I think if Chris Sale burns people again, I don't know how many more years he's going to have. So yeah, I think we could do that. All right, we're going to squeeze one last one in because Nick said we can go as long as we want. It's 10 o'clock right now. We're going to finish off with our 6th cluster, which is guys towards the end of right outside of the top, or sorry, inside the top 200. We have Nick Pivetta with an ADP of 184 going starting pitcher 46. Shane Baz with an ADP of 185 going starting pitcher 47. Bryce Miller with an ADP of 186 going starting pitcher 48. And Hunter Brown with an ADP of 187 going starting pitcher 49. David, any of these guys excite you at all?
I think I'm a glutton for punishment because I think I like Nick Pivetta here, and even though he's the highest
Whirlybird.
Yeah, I mean he's when you looked at the second half of last year, he was one of only 5 pitchers in baseball to record more than 100 strikeouts over the second half of the year. 102 over 73 and 2/3 innings, and he did that 8 of his 16 outings were out of the bullpen. 12.46 strikeouts per 9. I mean, and there's the StatCast metrics too. 93rd percentile with a 31.2% strikeout rate, 89th percentile in chase rate, 75th percentile in whiff rate. He wasn't giving up. I mean, he was giving up a lot of hard contact, but that's kind of what Nick Pivetta does. But I think the biggest reason why I'm really intrigued this year was obviously we know the strikeout stuff is there, and Scott kind of like when he was talking about the Braves and just the fact how much they wanted Chris Sale by trading their top prospect. The Red Sox have a new infrastructure in place right now. They have Andrew Bailey, who, for those that remember way back with the Oakland A's, dynamite closer there. He's the new pitching coach there. They have the director of pitching, Justin Willard, and they have Craig Breslow, who also has a lot of years pitching and is well respected around the league. I think they have a good philosophy in place that they're going to establish with Red Sox pitchers this year. And I think that could help unlock another Nick Pivetta. So I like, obviously the strikeout stuff is there, but I think the new infrastructure in place in Boston, I think is going to benefit someone like Nick Pivetta. So I'm willing to take the chance here at SP 46 with the strikeout upside, with the fact that I think there's another step that he could take this year to be more consistent. So I think he has the highest upside of this group.
Just for people who don't know, Justin Willard, who David mentioned, was the director of pitching development for the Twins. And obviously we saw the way that the Twins, Joe Ryan, Pablo Lopez, those guys took a huge step in the positive direction. And then the Red Sox also last week just agreed to, a contract, a deal with Kyle Boddy, who runs Driveline, to be kind of a special advisor in terms of pitching research and development. So obviously that's just another guy with kind of like really forward-thinking analytical experience in Boston. Scott, are you also in on Nick Pivetta? Is there somebody else in this group you like?
There are two I like in this group and two I really don't like in this group. The two I like in this group are Shane Boz, who, I have enough confidence in the Tommy John surgery rehabilitation plan, just how many pitchers have come back good as new from that I'm going to trust in the same for Shane Boz, certainly at the point he's being drafted here. And, prior to him messing up his elbow ligament, we were all pretty high on Shane Boz. We thought he was the best pitching prospect in baseball, and there's tons of upside there. Pivetta is the other one I like a lot. And just to add a few more interesting details to what David already said there. So to give you the second half numbers, it was a 3.30 ERA, a 0.96 whip, 12.5 K per nine, split between the bullpen and the rotation, but a lot of those relief appearances were like of the 3 to 4 inning variety. It was kind of a hybrid role he was filling. By the end, he was taking on a conventional starter's workload. I think his last two starts were both 7 innings for Pivetta. And what was most impressive about that was the strike gains, the strike throwing gains he made during his time in the bullpen carried over to that late stint back in the rotation. In mid-May, prior to moving to the bullpen, Pivetta threw only 63% of his pitches for strikes. Not very good. The rest of the way, mid-May on, 66%, which is rather good and about the best we've seen from him. I think the best we've seen from him since that 2019 season, when we also liked him a lot as a breakout candidate. So, and Pivetta's talked a lot about, he worked with Chris Martin, Red Sox reliever who throws a ton of strikes, it's worth noting, on mentality after his move to the bullpen. And he was kind of a mentor to him in that way. And it seemed to show in the results. So I think Pivetta at long last has figured it out. And for that strikeout upside, I'm willing to take a chance on him here. I do want to say really quickly, Bryce Miller is a bust pick for me this year. I don't really get the hype for him. He does have a great fastball, which I know you guys at Pitcher List like. That's about all he has. And it caught up to him the longer he stuck around in the majors. 1.15 ERA through his first 5 starts, 5.31 ERA in his next 20 starts. And, he wasn't going 6 innings with much consistency while putting together a 5.31 ERA. There have been some buzz about him maybe developing a splitter. I don't know. I'll believe it when I see it. But for now, I'm going to call Bryce Miller a bad use of draft capital here in the same range as these other guys.
Yeah. Just so I will complete this trio and be in on Nick Pivetta. The beginning of July, I joked about it at the beginning, but he did call his new slider the Whirly Bird. It's more of a sweeper than the traditional slider he was throwing before. He started throwing that when he was a reliever and then carried it into him being a starter. So people are going to look at like his relief splits and his starter splits and say, oh, he was better out of the bullpen. And as Scott pointed out, he was, but that carried over. And I do think a part of it was also, in addition to all the things you guys said, this change in pitch shape, which kind of changed his pitch mix. He had a 35.8% strikeout rate from July 1st on. And that was in 84 innings. So it's not like an incredibly small sample size. That's a lot of innings that he had a 29% K minus walk rate with a 0.97 whip and a 3.27 ERA. I think, that will continue on, not necessarily those exact numbers, but I think that success will continue on with that pitch mix. I'm also fully in on Shane Boz. We maybe forgot about him, but I think that he's ready to go. And given the other injuries they have in their starting rotation, I don't really see them slow playing him. I think he's going to be in the rotation from the beginning of the year. I will say that I have optimism for Bryce Miller, and I understand the trepidation that people have in drafting him right now before we've seen anything happen in spring, because a lot of the potential for Bryce Miller is, can the secondaries develop? And so maybe you need to see a couple of spring training starts to see if his pitch mix looks meaningfully different. But I think when you have a foundation of an elite fastball, and then you have additional pitches that have flashed at times, the sweeper at the end of the year was limiting hard contact. It wasn't consistently getting swings and misses. He threw a hard slider which was getting swings and misses, but was also getting barreled a lot. So it's like, can we find the middle ground in those off-speed pitches? He started throwing a sinker a lot more so that he wasn't just relying on a four seam like 70% of the time, which he did at the start. That actually improved the swinging strike rate on the four seam because obviously you're throwing a sinker inside to righties. You're giving them a different look. You can then elevate a four seam and you get more swings and misses. So he was tinkering as the year went on and nothing clicked. But given the fact that we've seen the guys in his same rotation use driveline, use these outside resources to continue shaping their pitch mix, he's a guy who I have optimism for. I'm not ready to like say, hey, I'm drafting him, with Bobby Miller and Yuri Perez and all those guys, but I am eagerly awaiting his spring training starts because I think if we can get at least one more competent secondary pitch, I think Bryce Miller's in for a pretty solid second season. And I'm also not ready to give up on Hunter Brown. I have concerns, obviously. The first half of the year was pretty good. And he fell off like hard. And I think a lot of that is like a young kid who seemed to change drastically how he was pitching. And he wasn't throwing his fastball up in the zone. He was using his slider, not using his slider, using it sometimes as a strikeout pitch, using it sometimes early in the count. So he needs to kind of like lock in on who he is as a pitcher, but I think the raw stuff there still interests me. And he's outside, he's like around 50 for me, I believe. But I think that there's upside there that I'm intrigued by. As we head out, why don't you guys tell people again where they can find your work and maybe just kind of give us a little hint at what's coming down the pipeline for you, whether it's a podcast or an article or something. We'll start with you, David.
Thanks again for hosting, Eric, because this was an awesome panel. And Scott, it was fun hanging out and talking with you as well. You can find me on Twitter at DMendio2. We do the Triple Play Fantasy Baseball podcasts every Wednesday or sometimes Thursday night. And right now we're going through our position previews. We're always on YouTube streaming live. And so you can check us out there. And I post a lot of baseball and football content throughout the week on my Twitter. So check it out on there. And yeah, it was fun chatting pitchers with you guys. So this was a great time.
Well, this is my busiest time of year, pretty much beginning now, the gear up to opening day and draft prep season when all eyes are on us, right? Fantasy Baseball Today podcast. We're going to ramp up to 5 days a week very soon. We broadcast 5 days a week throughout the season. So that's going to be a great resource for you. And right now, as far as the writing goes, I'm on kind of a dynasty kick. I'm going to be doing a dynasty survey where I go through, where I ask people on social media which players they prefer at each position in a dynasty league and kind of review the results. And it's kind of interesting especially to compare that from year to year. But pretty soon, at beginning next week, I'll be coming out with my position strategies, which are, I think, among the most helpful pieces of content I write during draft prep season. And I would encourage you to check those out so that I can continue to justify writing them during draft prep season. And then it only ramps up from there. There's going to be so much. Check it out at cbssports.com.
Yeah. Thank you both for being on here. It was awesome chatting with you. I've read and followed both of your work, but this is obviously the first time we've gotten to like talk shop. And so it was a lot of fun. You can find me on Twitter at Samulski NYC. Podcast, you can find me on the corner with Nick here at Pitcher List, talking pitchers all the time. The Roto World Fantasy Baseball Show, which I do with DJ Short, is restarting again this week and next week. And so you'll be able to find that anywhere you can find podcasts. I always tweet out my articles, which you can also find on Roto World. I'm putting out 2, sometimes 3 a week, depending on how much I want to like be in a bunker and write. Mainly starting pitcher, draft prep stuff. But I just put out some stuff based on like hitter values, based on plate discipline metrics. And so I'll be doing some guys with shaky plate discipline, who might be guys to avoid. And then I'm starting a YouTube series called Pick 3 ADP, where I go through each draft round and talk about guys I like in that round and guys I'm fading in that round. And so I will also put that on Twitter, but you can find it on the NBC Sports and Roto World YouTube page as well. And even though Nick hasn't come on to like play us off yet, I think we're done.